On a pitch-black autumn night, Daniel Reynolds found himself driving down a desolate stretch of Highway 89. The road was infamous in the area, not for its curves or condition, but for the unsettling tales that surrounded it. Most dismissed the stories as urban legends. A hitchhiker who disappeared upon reaching the town line, phantom lights in the woods, and whispers of missing persons. Daniel didn't believe in any of that. He was a skeptic, and he liked the solitude these roads offered. But tonight, solitude would take on a sinister meaning. The moon hung low, veiled by thick clouds that barely allowed its pale glow to filter through. His car's headlights stretched ahead, illuminating the endless road flanked by dense woods. Trees swayed in the wind, their shadows flickering and dancing like ghostly figures. His radio crackled, briefly picking up snatches of a distant station before devolving into static. He reached out to turn it off when his phone buzzed. Glancing at the screen, Daniel saw it was a message from his sister. "Drive safe. Call when you get home." He smirked and typed a quick reply at a stop sign, assuring her he'd be fine. As he pressed send, something caught his eye. Movement in the woods. A quick, fleeting shadow darted across the trees, barely discernible in the faint light. His breath hitched. "Just a deer," he muttered to himself. Yet, as he accelerated, the unsettling feeling gnawed at him. The night seemed darker, heavier, as if the air itself thickened, pressing down on him. The road stretched endlessly, and the occasional road signs passed by too quickly to read. Time felt warped. Hadn't he passed that broken tree trunk before? It was then he saw her. At first, she was just a speck in the distance, standing on the shoulder of the road. As he drew closer, his stomach tightened. A young woman, drenched from head to toe as though caught in a downpour that hadn't touched the rest of the road. Her hair hung limp over her face, and she wore a pale dress, its hem caked with dirt. One of her bare feet seemed twisted at an odd angle. Instinct screamed at Daniel to drive past her, but something stronger compelled him to slow down. Rolling the passenger window down just a crack, he asked, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't reply. Her head tilted ever so slightly, her wet hair parting just enough to reveal a sliver of her face. A single eye stared at him, wide, unblinking, and glassy, like that of a doll. Daniel's skin prickled. I can call someone for you," he stammered. "Do you need me to take you to the next town?" Still, no response. She stepped closer, her movements unnatural, as if she were being yanked forward by invisible strings. The closer she got, the colder the air inside the car became. Daniel's breath fogged the windshield. Without another thought, he slammed his foot on the gas and sped away. The car's tires screeched, and for a moment, he thought he heard a scream. A guttural, wrenching sound that echoed in his ears long after he left her behind. He forced himself to glance in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The road behind him was empty. His heart thundered in his chest, his grip on the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles ache. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. The unease didn't fade. In fact, it grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His gaze darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat, but it was empty. Still, the sensation of being watched was unbearable. Then his headlights flickered. No, no, no," he muttered. "Not now." He banged the dashboard, but the lights sputtered again before plunging him into darkness. Daniel pulled over, his breathing shallow. He flipped the switch for the high beams, but they didn't respond. The engine hummed steadily, and the dashboard lights remained on. It didn't make sense. He checked his phone, hoping to use its flashlight, but the screen was dead despite being fully charged earlier. Panic crept in. Something tapped on the window. Daniel froze. The sound came again, light, deliberate, almost playful. Slowly, he turned his head. There she was. The woman stood inches away, her face pressed against the glass. Her eye just one, hollow and lifeless, locked onto him. Her lips twisted into a grin that stretched too wide, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. Daniel screamed, slamming his foot on the gas without even looking at the road. The car lurched forward, and he swore he heard a sickening thump as if he'd hit something, or someone. He didn't stop. His rational mind screamed at him to turn around, to check, but the primal fear driving him was too strong. The road ahead seemed unfamiliar, despite this being a route he'd taken dozens of times. Trees loomed closer to the road, their gnarled branches clawing at the car like hands. The wind howled, carrying with it faint whispers he couldn't quite make out. Every instinct told him he wasn't driving away from her. He was driving deeper into something worse. The air inside the car grew oppressive, thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. The radio, though turned off, crackled to life. A voice, distorted and static-filled, whispered, "You can't leave." Daniel yelled, slamming the radio with his fist, but the voice only grew louder. "She's with you." Suddenly his headlights burst back to life, illuminating the road ahead, and her. She stood directly in his path, her arms outstretched, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. Daniel swerved, the tires screeching as he veered off the road and into the ditch. The car jolted violently before coming to a stop. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the ticking of the engine and his ragged breathing. Blood trickled down his forehead from where he'd hit the steering wheel. He fumbled with the seatbelt, desperate to get out, to run, but the buckle wouldn't budge. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. She crawled toward the car on all fours, her body bending and twisting in ways that defied anatomy. Her face pressed against the windshield, her grin now impossibly wide, splitting her face in half. Her voice, guttural and mocking, filled the car without her lips moving. "You should have stopped." The windows shattered, and darkness swallowed Daniel whole. When his car was found the next morning, it was empty. The doors were locked from the inside, and the glass was intact. No footprints surrounded the vehicle, but on the back seat, investigators found a single wet footprint and a strand of long, black hair. Daniel Reynolds was never seen again.
Story number 2.
The air was sharp and frigid as Angela Parker drove along Ridgeway Pass, a notorious mountain road that slithered between jagged cliffs and dense forest. It was well past midnight, and the moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees. Angela clutched the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening as her old sedan climbed the serpentine road. Her destination was her late grandmother's cabin, a place she hadn't visited since childhood. The inheritance papers had arrived weeks ago, but Angela had been putting off the trip. Something about that cabin made her uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Tonight, she had no choice. The paperwork required her signature by morning. Her headlights sliced through the darkness, casting fleeting light on the looming trees and sheer drop-offs. The occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of an owl was the only sound besides the hum of her engine. She tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to fatigue and her nerves, but when the first thump echoed through the car, she flinched. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the tires on asphalt. Angela slowed, glancing in her rearview mirror. Nothing, just darkness stretching endlessly behind her. "Get a grip," she muttered, pressing the gas again. But as she rounded the next curve, the thump returned, this time louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the trunk. Her stomach churned. Maybe she'd hit something earlier without noticing. A raccoon, a branch, and it had lodged itself under the car. She pulled over onto a narrow shoulder, her heart pounding as she stepped into the night. The air outside was colder than she'd anticipated. She wrapped her jacket tighter around herself and approached the trunk cautiously. Her flashlight beam wavered as her hand shook, sweeping over the glossy surface of the car. There was no visible damage, no blood or debris. She bent down, shining the light under the vehicle. Still, nothing. Relieved, she straightened up, but a sound made her freeze. A faint scratching came from inside the trunk. Angela's breath hitched. She stared at the trunk, her mind racing. Was it an animal? Or worse, someone? Her hands trembled as she fished her keys from her pocket. She hesitated, then unlocked the trunk and threw it open. It was empty. The cold silence of the forest pressed in around her. Her flashlight flickered for a moment, plunging her into brief darkness before stabilizing. Angela exhaled shakily, slamming the trunk shut. As she climbed back into the driver's seat, she noticed her phone lying on the passenger seat. The screen was lit, showing a single notification. Unknown number. Don't stop again. Angela's blood ran cold. She hadn't heard the phone vibrate. The message had to have come while she was outside. Her shaking hands clutched the phone as she scanned her surroundings. The forest was still, the darkness oppressive. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't happening." She locked the doors and hit the gas, the tires skidding slightly as she sped back onto the road. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She considered calling the police, but the nearest town was miles away, and she wasn't even sure what she'd tell them. A strange text? A phantom sound in the trunk? They'd think she was crazy. The road twisted sharply ahead, and she focused on navigating the curves, but even as she drove, her eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The darkness behind her seemed to shift, as though something was moving just beyond the reach of her taillights. Then the scratching started again. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the sound grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't coming from the trunk this time. It was inside the car. Angela screamed, swerving violently as she twisted around to look at the back seat. It was empty. The sound stopped. Her chest heaved as she steadied the car. Tears blurred her vision, and she blinked them away, forcing herself to focus on the road. She had to keep driving. She had to reach the cabin. Once she was there, she'd lock the doors, call for help, and her thoughts shattered as her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Angela slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere feet from the figure. Her heart pounded as she stared. It was a man, or what she thought was a man. He was impossibly tall, his limbs elongated and unnaturally thin. His face was pale and smooth, devoid of features except for a wide, lipless mouth that curved into a grotesque smile. The man tilted his head, the movement jerky and inhuman. Angela's hands fumbled with the gear shift as she tried to reverse, but the car wouldn't budge. The man began to walk toward her, his long legs closing the distance with horrifying speed. Come on, she pleaded, slamming her foot on the pedal. The car sputtered but refused to move. The man was at her window now, his face level with hers. His mouth opened wider, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. His skeletal fingers tapped on the glass, each tap resonating like a hammer blow in her ears. Angela screamed, covering her face as the window shattered. Glass rained down on her, slicing her hands and arms. When she looked up, the man was gone. The road was empty. The car started on its own, the engine roaring to life. Angela didn't question it. She floored the gas, her tears blurring the road ahead. The cabin wasn't far now. She repeated the thought like a mantra, clinging to it as her only lifeline. The driveway appeared suddenly, the gravel crunching under her tires as she skidded to a stop. She stumbled out of the car, clutching her bleeding arm, and bolted for the cabin. The front door was unlocked, and she slammed it shut behind her, twisting the deadbolt with shaking hands. Inside, the cabin was eerily silent. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. Angela leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You shouldn't have stopped. Her scream echoed through the empty cabin as the lights flickered and died.
Story number 3.
The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming on the roof of Olivia's aging sedan as she navigated the narrow back roads of Whisper Hollow. The small town, isolated and surrounded by sprawling woods, had a reputation, one Olivia dismissed as local superstition. She was a journalist, after all, tasked with debunking the myths of the Screamer of Whisper Hollow, a local legend about a woman's anguished wails luring travelers into the forest, never to return. Her headlights barely pierced the downpour, casting distorted beams that illuminated the winding road. The GPS on her phone chirped its directions, though the signal had been spotty for miles. Olivia glanced at the screen. The estimated time to the town's only inn had jumped from 5 minutes to 15. Frowning, she muttered, "Stupid app," and tapped the screen, but the recalculated route veered further into the woods. The car's clock read 11:47 p.m. She tightened her grip on the wheel, unease prickling her skin. The road was deserted, save for the towering trees that lined it like silent sentinels. The sound of rain on the windshield grew deafening, drowning out the low hum of her engine. Then she heard it, a shrill, piercing scream that cut through the storm like a blade. Her foot slammed on the brake. The car skidded to a halt, its tires kicking up a spray of water and mud. Olivia sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She rolled down the window slightly, letting in the damp night air. The scream came again, raw and guttural, as if torn from a throat ravaged by despair. Her journalist instincts kicked in. Grabbing her flashlight and phone, she stepped out into the storm, her boots sinking into the muddy road. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Is someone out there? Do you need help?" The scream answered, louder this time, echoing from the woods to her left. Olivia hesitated, her rational mind warring with her curiosity, but the sound of pain, of desperation, compelled her forward. She crossed the ditch and stepped into the forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Her flashlight's beam wavered, slicing through the rain, but revealing little beyond slick bark and undergrowth. The scream came again, closer now, sending a shiver down her spine. "Hello?" she called again, pushing deeper into the woods. Her phone screen lit up briefly, the GPS flickering before the signal dropped entirely. She cursed under her breath and shoved it into her pocket. The forest seemed alive, the shadows shifting and pulsing with the storm. The scream sounded once more, but this time it was accompanied by something worse, a low, guttural sob that reverberated through the trees. Olivia's breath quickened as she pressed on, the muddy ground sucking at her boots. The sound drew her to a small clearing where the rain slackened and the air grew unnaturally still. In the center stood a woman, her back to Olivia. She was hunched, her soaked dress clinging to her frail frame. Her long, matted hair obscured her face. "Ma'am?" Olivia said, stepping closer. "Are you okay? Were you the one screaming?" The woman didn't respond. She stood motionless, her head bowed as if in prayer. Olivia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the flashlight. Something about the woman felt wrong, unnatural. The air around her was heavy, oppressive, and Olivia noticed the faint smell of decay. "Hey, do you need help?" She tried again, her voice trembling. The woman straightened slowly, her movements jerky as if controlled by unseen strings. Olivia took a step back. The woman turned her head just enough for Olivia to catch a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were hollow voids, black and endless, and her mouth stretched open in a silent scream. Olivia stumbled backward, her flashlight tumbling from her hands and landing in the mud. Darkness swallowed the clearing. The woman let out a sound that wasn't human, a shriek that pierced Olivia's ears and seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Panicked, Olivia scrambled for the flashlight, her fingers slipping in the mud. She grabbed it and flicked it back on, but the woman was gone. The clearing was empty, save for the rain and the rustling trees. Heart pounding, Olivia turned to run but froze. The woman stood directly in her path, her face inches from Olivia's. Her blackened eyes locked onto Olivia's, and a grin spread across her face, impossibly wide, splitting her cheeks to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Olivia screamed as the woman lunged, her cold, skeletal hands gripping Olivia's arms. The forest spun around her, and the world went black. When Olivia woke, the rain had stopped. She lay in the middle of the road, her clothes soaked and muddy. Her car was gone, and the forest was silent. Shaking, she reached for her phone. It lit up, displaying a single notification. "Unknown number. You've been marked." Her scream echoed through the empty night, carried away by the whispering trees.
Story number 4.
The fluorescent lights of the all-night diner flickered as Ethan wiped his glasses and checked his watch. 1:23 a.m. He had been on the road for hours, and exhaustion tugged at his eyelids. The rain outside continued to pour in relentless sheets, turning the empty highway into a glistening black mirror. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, placed a cup of steaming coffee in front of him without a word. Her uniform was faded, and her name tag simply read, "Betty." Ethan murmured his thanks, but her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. She glanced toward the window, then back at him, before shuffling away. The diner was nearly empty, save for a man seated in the far corner booth. Ethan hadn't noticed him come in, but there he was, his face obscured by the brim of a black hat. His hands rested on the table, unnaturally still, like a statue. Something about the man made Ethan uneasy. He turned his attention back to his coffee, trying to push away the creeping discomfort. The warmth of the mug was grounding. He took a sip, the bitter liquid jolting his senses. Rain continued to hammer against the windows, drowning out the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then the bell above the diner door jingled. Ethan looked up instinctively. A young woman entered, her soaked coat dripping onto the floor. Her hair clung to her pale face, and her eyes darted nervously around the diner before locking onto Ethan. She moved quickly toward him, her boots squelching against the linoleum. "Can I sit here?" she asked, her voice trembling. She didn't wait for a reply and slid into the booth across from him, glancing over her shoulder toward the man in the corner. Sure," Ethan said, confused. "Are you okay?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Don't look directly at him," she whispered. "The man in the corner, don't look at him." Ethan blinked, his confusion deepening. Why? What's going on? She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. He's been following me. I don't think he's human. Ethan frowned, glancing toward the corner booth despite her warning. The man was still sitting there, but his head was now slightly tilted as if he were listening. Ethan's stomach tightened. You're probably just spooked, he said, trying to sound reassuring. It's late, and the storm... I'm not crazy, she interrupted, her voice sharp. I've been running for miles. He doesn't stop. He doesn't even blink. Ethan opened his mouth to reply, but the words died in his throat as the lights flickered again, plunging the diner into brief darkness. When they came back on, the man in the corner was gone. The booth where he had been sitting was empty, the seat dry as if no one had been there at all. Ethan's heart raced as he scanned the diner. The waitress was gone too. The only sound was the rain and the faint buzzing of the lights. I told you, the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. He doesn't just follow, he gets inside. Ethan's skin prickled. What does that mean? She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze fixed on the window. Ethan followed her eyes and felt his breath catch. Outside in the rain, the man stood under the flickering neon sign of the diner. He didn't move, didn't flinch as the rain poured over him. His black hat obscured most of his face, but Ethan could see his eyes, or lack of them. Two empty sockets stared directly at the window, unblinking. We need to go, the woman said, grabbing his arm. Her touch was ice cold. Now! Ethan hesitated. We can't just... Now! She screamed, yanking him from the booth. They burst out of the diner and into the storm, the freezing rain soaking them instantly. The parking lot was empty. Ethan's car, the only vehicle there moments ago, was gone. He spun around looking for any sign of the waitress or anyone else, but the world seemed deserted. The man was no longer under the neon sign. Where is he? Ethan asked, his voice shaking. He's close, the woman said, her teeth chattering. He always is. A low, raspy sound filled the air, like a wet breath drawn through broken lungs. Ethan turned and his heart plummeted. The man was standing just a few feet away, his hat tilted upward now to reveal his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, his mouth filled with too many teeth, sharp and jagged. The man took a step forward, his movements unnervingly slow, deliberate. Ethan stumbled back, pulling the woman with him. What is he? He shouted. I don't know, she cried, but he never stops. The man took another step, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. That raspy sound grew louder, almost like laughter. Ethan grabbed the woman's hand and bolted toward the highway, his shoes slipping on the wet asphalt. They ran until their lungs burned, until the diner was nothing but a faint glow in the distance. The rain showed no mercy, soaking them to the bone. Ethan glanced back only once, and there he was, the man, standing impossibly still in the middle of the road, watching. Finally, they reached an overpass where they could catch their breath. Ethan collapsed against the concrete wall, his chest heaving. The woman crouched beside him, her hands shaking. We're safe for now, she whispered. But Ethan wasn't so sure. His skin crawled with the feeling of being watched. He looked toward the road, expecting to see the man in the distance, but it was empty. Then the woman beside him stiffened. Her head turned slowly, unnaturally, until her hollow eyes met his. You never really escape, she said, her voice no longer her own. And then she screamed.
Story number 5.
The engine of the old Jeep sputtered as Clara maneuvered it down the winding dirt road. She cursed under her breath, tapping the gas pedal in the hope of silencing the ominous sound. It was the last thing she needed, being stranded in the middle of nowhere at nearly 2 a.m. Her headlights illuminated the thick woods on either side of the road, the trees forming a dense, suffocating wall. Clara was heading home after visiting a friend who lived in a remote countryside town. She had ignored warnings about taking the shortcut through Hollow Ridge Road, a stretch infamous for its eerie reputation. Legends told of people who took the road but never made it out. Of course, Clara didn't believe in ghosts or curses. She believed in poor road maintenance and urban legends cooked up to scare kids. But as the Jeep stuttered again, Clara couldn't help but feel the creeping weight of unease. The forest seemed unnaturally silent, save for the crunch of gravel beneath her tires. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant howls. Just silence, thick and oppressive. The dim glow of her headlights barely penetrated the darkness ahead, and the narrow road twisted unpredictably. Then, out of nowhere, she saw it. A figure. It stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlights. Clara slammed the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The Jeep skidded to a halt just feet away. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, dressed in tattered white clothes that hung loosely from her emaciated frame. Her long, matted hair obscured most of her face. Clara's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. She leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. The woman didn't react to the bright lights shining directly on her. She just stood there, her head tilted downward at an unnatural angle. Clara honked the horn. The sound echoed through the night, but the woman didn't flinch. She remained still like a grotesque mannequin planted in the road. Clara's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. No normal person would stand there like that. She rolled down her window slightly, leaning out. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman's head jerked upward sharply, revealing her face, or what was left of it. Her eyes were hollow sockets, and her mouth was a gaping, toothless hole. Clara gasped, her foot slamming on the gas pedal instinctively. The Jeep roared forward, swerving around the figure. As she sped past, she caught a glimpse of the woman's head twisting unnaturally to follow her movement. Clara didn't look back. Her heart pounded as the Jeep raced down the narrow road, the woods on either side blurring into an indistinct wall of black. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen, a trick of the light, her tired mind playing tricks on her. But then the engine sputtered again. The Jeep jerked violently, and Clara cursed, gripping the wheel tighter. "No, no, no," she shouted as the vehicle slowed to a crawl and finally stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. Clara fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. She slapped the steering wheel in frustration and glanced into the rearview mirror. Her blood ran cold. The woman was there, standing directly behind the Jeep. Clara's breath hitched as she locked the doors, her fingers trembling. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, her hollow eyes fixed on the Jeep. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't sit here and wait for whatever that thing was to make its move. She had to get out, had to run. Grabbing her flashlight from the glove compartment, she shoved the door open and bolted into the woods. Branches scratched at her arms and face as she ran blindly, the flashlight's beam bobbing wildly. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. The sound of crunching leaves followed her. Clara's chest burned as she pushed herself to run faster. She dared a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The woman was there, gliding through the trees without moving her legs, her skeletal hands reaching out toward Clara. "No!" Clara screamed, pushing harder. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, the flashlight flying from her grasp. Pain shot through her ankle as she scrambled to her feet, grabbing the flashlight and swinging it around wildly. The woman was gone. The forest was still, the silence deafening. Clara's ragged breaths were the only sound. She limped forward, shining the light in every direction. The woods seemed to close in on her, the trees looming like sinister figures. Then she heard it, a faint, rasping whisper. It came from all around her, as if the very trees were speaking. Clara's grip tightened on the flashlight as she turned in a slow circle, her heart thundering in her ears. "Leave." The whisper was louder now, more distinct. Clara's knees buckled, and she nearly collapsed. She pointed the flashlight toward the sound and froze. The woman stood just a few feet away, her hollow eyes staring directly into Clara's soul. Her mouth stretched into an impossible grin, splitting her face from ear to ear. "You should have stayed on the main road," the woman hissed. Clara screamed, turning to run, but her injured ankle gave out. She fell again, the flashlight skittering away. Darkness enveloped her as she clawed at the ground, desperate to escape. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the woman standing over her, reaching out with those skeletal hands. Clara's Jeep was found the next morning, abandoned on Hollow Ridge Road. The driver's side door was open, and the keys were still in the ignition. There was no sign of Clara, but deep in the woods, searchers found something strange. A single flashlight, its beam still flickering weakly, lying next to a patch of disturbed earth.
Story number 6.
The moon hung low in the night sky, casting a pale light over the empty stretch of highway. Mia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as her car ate up the miles. It had been a long day at her grandmother's house. Sorting through old belongings, sifting through memories, and fighting off the strange unease that clung to the air of the old place. She glanced at the dashboard. 12:47 a.m. The highway was eerily quiet, her car the only sign of life for miles. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt was oddly soothing, and her eyelids grew heavy. Then she saw it. A hitchhiker. The figure stood on the shoulder of the road, arm outstretched, thumb pointing upward. The man wore a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. Mia's grip on the wheel tightened as she approached. She wasn't about to stop. Not at this hour, not on this desolate road. But as her car sped past, the man's head snapped toward her, and she swore she saw his eyes glint, reflective like an animal's in the headlights. Her heart skipped a beat. She shook her head, laughing nervously to herself. "You're just tired, Mia. Imagining things." She turned up the radio, letting the music drown out her thoughts. The road stretched on, an unbroken ribbon of darkness ahead. The hitchhiker was just a fleeting encounter, a blip in the monotony of the drive, until she saw him again. A mile down the road, he was there, standing on the shoulder, same coat, same hat, same shadowed face. Her foot eased off the gas and she stared, disbelief flooding her. "What the hell?" she whispered. It wasn't possible. She hadn't passed any side roads, no way for him to get ahead of her. She pressed harder on the accelerator, her car surging forward. The hitchhiker vanished into the night behind her. Her heart raced, pounding in her ears as she gripped the wheel tighter. 3 miles later, he was back. This time, he stood in the middle of the road. Mia screamed and swerved, her tires screeching as the car veered onto the shoulder. She fought to regain control, narrowly avoiding the ditch. When she came to a stop, she looked back, trembling. The man was gone. Breathing heavily, she tried to steady herself. "It's just the dark playing tricks on you," she muttered. "You're tired. You need to get home." She restarted the car and pulled back onto the road. Her nerves frayed. But as she drove, the unease grew. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her. Every rustle of wind against the car felt like fingers dragging along the metal. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the engine. A rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the rear passenger window. Mia froze, her blood turning to ice. She didn't dare look. She couldn't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She clutched the wheel, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. "Keep driving?" She whispered to herself. "Just keep driving." But the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavier, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Finally, she couldn't resist. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker sat in the back seat, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. But she could see his smile, a grotesque, impossibly wide grin filled with jagged teeth. His eyes glinted in the dark, just like they had on the road. Mia screamed and slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, and when she whipped around to face the back seat, it was empty. Her hands shook as she fumbled to unlock the doors and stepped out, the cool night air biting at her skin. She scanned the area, her flashlight from the glove box slicing through the dark. Nothing. No hitchhiker. No tracks. Just the empty highway stretching endlessly in both directions. She was alone. Or so she thought. As she climbed back into the car, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. Her headlights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging her into darkness. And then she heard his voice. "You shouldn't have passed me." It was low, guttural, and came from everywhere at once. Her flashlight flickered, and she saw him, standing just outside the driver's side window, his grin wider than before, his face now fully illuminated. The skin was stretched taut over his skull, but his eyes gleaming with malice. Mia screamed again, slamming her foot on the gas. The car roared to life, lurching forward into the darkness. The man didn't chase her. He didn't need to, because when she glanced in the mirror again, he was in the back seat, smiling.
Story number 7.
The narrow mountain road was shrouded in fog, the headlights of Sam's car barely cutting through the thick, swirling mist. He cursed under his breath. Driving through the Rockies was never fun at night, but the fog made it treacherous. The GPS had been unreliable for the past hour, rerouting him through unfamiliar paths that seemed to wind endlessly upward. "Great," he muttered. "A shortcut to nowhere." The clock on the dashboard blinked 2:13 a.m. Sam adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, trying to shake the creeping unease settling in his gut. The dense trees on either side of the road pressed in like dark sentinels, their branches clawing at the mist. Then he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Sam slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a halt just feet away. Heart pounding, he peered through the windshield. The figure was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his head tilted down as if studying the ground. Sam rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, are you okay? Need a ride?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised his head and Sam's stomach churned. The man's face was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. Sam yanked the window up and floored the gas pedal, swerving around the figure. The car fishtailed but steadied, and he sped away, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, glancing in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. 5 minutes later, Sam began to calm down. It must have been a trick of the light, he reasoned. The fog, his tired mind playing tricks on him. He shook his head, trying to laugh it off. But then his radio crackled to life, though he hadn't turned it on. A faint, garbled voice came through the static, whispering words he couldn't understand. He reached out to turn it off, but the volume dial spun wildly on its own, the whispers growing louder. "Leave," the voice hissed. "You shouldn't be here." Sam's hand jerked back as if the radio had burned him. His chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He slammed his fist against the dash, and the radio went silent. The relief was short-lived. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. His head whipped toward the passenger seat, and he froze. The man was there, sitting beside him. His blank face was turned toward Sam, the smooth expanse of skin eerily calm. Sam's scream caught in his throat as he swerved violently, the car veering off the road and slamming to a stop against a tree. When he opened his eyes, the passenger seat was empty. The man was gone. Sam stumbled out of the car, his hands trembling. The fog was thicker now, curling around him like a living thing. He grabbed his phone from his pocket, but there was no signal. A faint sound reached his ears. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind. He turned, and there, standing just at the edge of the fog, was the man. "You shouldn't be here," the man's voice echoed, though his face remained expressionless. Sam didn't wait. He ran, his shoes slipping on the wet ground as he darted into the trees. Branches tore at his clothes, and the fog seemed to grow denser, wrapping around him like cold hands. The footsteps followed. No matter how fast he ran, they stayed just behind him, steady and unhurried. He glanced over his shoulder and stumbled, his heart nearly stopping. The man wasn't walking anymore. He was floating, his blank face glowing faintly in the mist, his arms outstretched. Sam tripped and fell hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. He scrambled backward, his palms scraping against the rough ground. The man loomed over him, impossibly tall now, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. "You were warned," the man said, his voice reverberating through the fog. "But you didn't listen." Sam's scream echoed through the trees as the fog swallowed him whole. The next day, rangers found Sam's car on the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open. Deep in the woods, they discovered a trail of footprints that led to a clearing. In the center was a single, perfectly smooth tree with no bark or branches, just a pale, unbroken surface. No sign of Sam was ever found. But on quiet nights, when the fog rolls in, travelers swear they see a man standing in the road, waiting.
Story number 8.
The wind howled as Jenna steered her car down the desolate country road, her GPS claiming it was the fastest way to the highway. The old route was devoid of streetlights, the inky darkness broken only by her flickering headlights. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as the road seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The radio crackled. She reached over to turn it off, but as her fingers brushed the dial, a voice whispered through the static. "Turn back." Jenna froze, her eyes darting to the radio. The voice was faint, almost a sigh, but it was there. Shaking her head, she turned the volume down and focused on the road. "Just interference," she muttered, trying to reassure herself. But her heart raced, and the air inside the car felt heavier. As the road curved, she saw a figure ahead, standing in the middle of the lane. A man wearing what looked like an old coat and a brimmed hat. His face was shadowed, and his posture was unnervingly still. She slowed the car, rolling to a stop a few feet away. The man didn't move. "Do you need help?" Jenna called out, leaning slightly out of her window. The man's head jerked up sharply, revealing a face with hollow, empty sockets where his eyes should have been. His mouth twisted into a grin that seemed too wide, too wrong. Jenna screamed and slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing as she backed up. The figure didn't pursue her. He just stood there, grinning in the glow of her taillights. She pulled a U-turn and sped back the way she came, her heart hammering in her chest. The road was narrow, and the forest on either side loomed oppressively close. She kept glancing in her rearview mirror, expecting to see him chasing her. Instead, he was in front of her again. Jenna slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a halt. The man was now standing on the shoulder, staring at her with those empty sockets. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed to the woods. "No," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. She threw the car into gear, speeding past him, but as she passed, his head turned unnaturally to follow her, his grin never faltering. The road ahead seemed different now. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches forming claw-like shapes that seemed to reach for her. The air grew colder, her breath fogging up the windshield. Her headlights flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment, everything went black. When the lights came back on, she wasn't on the road anymore. Her car sat in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by ancient, crumbling gravestones. The forest loomed at the edges, dark and impenetrable. She had no idea how she'd gotten there, and every instinct screamed at her to leave. She tried to start the car, but the engine sputtered and died. She tried again, her panic mounting, but the car refused to respond. Outside, the wind carried a faint, chilling sound, a low, guttural laugh. Her phone had no signal. She was trapped. Then she saw him again, standing among the gravestones. His figure seemed taller now, his coat billowing as if caught in a wind she couldn't feel. Slowly, deliberately, he began to walk toward her, his movements unnaturally stiff. Jenna locked the doors, her fingers trembling. "Go away," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone." He didn't stop. The grin on his face stretched wider, impossibly wide, splitting his pale skin. When he reached the car, he leaned down, his empty sockets peering through the driver's side window. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and echoing, as though it came from the depths of the earth. The windows began to frost over, the temperature inside the car plummeting. Jenna screamed as the man reached out, his skeletal fingers pressing against the glass. Cracks spread like spider webs across the window. In desperation, she grabbed her flashlight from the glove box and swung the door open, bolting into the woods. Branches clawed at her as she ran, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear him, footsteps crunching on the frosted ground, slow and deliberate. The laughter followed her, echoing between the trees. She stumbled into another clearing, her breath hitching as she realized it was the same one she'd just left. Her car was there, but now it was covered in frost, the windows completely opaque, and he was standing next to it, waiting. Jenna fell to her knees, her flashlight slipping from her grasp. The man tilted his head, his grin somehow growing even larger. "You belong here now," he whispered. The last thing Jenna saw was his face, impossibly close as the world dissolved into darkness. When the police found her car days later, it was abandoned in the middle of Hollow Pines Cemetery, miles away from the main road. The frost on the windows hadn't melted, even under the midday sun. Jenna was never seen again, but some say if you drive that road late at night, you might see her running through the woods, forever trying to escape the man with no eyes.